Between 1971 and 1980, Ford Motor Company built 3 million Pintos. At its peak, the Pinto was Ford's best-selling subcompact car, moving over 400,000 units per year and generating more than $1 billion in annual revenue. Walk into any American parking lot in the mid-1970s, and there was a good chance you'd find one sitting right there, affordable and practical, and exactly what a generation of working families needed from a car. It was one of Ford's great commercial triumphs, and it was killing people. The Pinto's fuel tank, mounted just 6 inches behind the rear bumper with almost no structural protection between it and the outside world, ruptured in low-speed rear-end collisions of the kind that happen thousands of times a day on American roads. The tank split, gasoline flooded the cabin, and the car caught fire, often before anyone inside had a chance to get out. When investigators eventually dug into Ford's internal records, what they found was not a company that had missed something or failed to anticipate a problem. What they found was a memo, a cold, methodical calculation that laid out how many people Ford expected to die, how much those deaths would cost in settlements, and why it was cheaper to pay the families than to fix the car. Ford had known before the first Pinto ever left the factory floor, and they had made a decision. To understand how Ford got there, you have to go back to the late 1960s, when the American auto industry found itself facing a problem it had spent years pretending didn't exist. Imports were taking over. Volkswagen Beetles were parked in driveways from Connecticut to California. Toyota Corollas were selling faster than dealers could stock them, and the smaller, more fuel-efficient Japanese and European cars were steadily claiming market share that Detroit had always assumed was its own. Between 1960 and 1970, import sales in the United States had climbed from roughly 600,000 units to over 1.5 million, a jump of more than 150% in a single decade, and the trend was still accelerating. General Motors was rushing to build the Vega, American Motors had the Gremlin in development, Chrysler was working on its own answer, and Lee Iacocca, then president of Ford Motor Company, had decided that Ford would not be caught flat-footed. Iacocca laid down a directive that became known inside the company as the 2000-2000 rule. The new car would weigh no more than 2,000 pounds, cost no more than $2,000 at retail, and it would be in showrooms by the 1971 model year. That gave Ford's engineers roughly 25 months to design, test, and manufacture an entirely new vehicle from scratch, in an industry where a normal development cycle ran closer to 45 months. The people doing the engineering work in Dearborn understood that this was an impossible timeline, but Iacocca was not inviting debate on the schedule. The market was moving, imports were gaining ground every month, and Ford was going to have an answer on the showroom floor by the fall of 1970. The design came together fast. Rear-wheel drive, a 4-cylinder engine, simple unibody construction, styling that borrowed enough from the Mustang to look sporty without adding $1 of cost to the platform. It was exactly what Iacocca had ordered, a compact American car that could compete with the Beetle on price and beat it on looks. But inside the engineering specifications, something had gone wrong in a way that nobody at Ford's executive level chose to address. The fuel tank had been placed behind the rear axle rather than between the axle and the rear seat, which was the safer and more common configuration used by most manufacturers at the time. With the tank sitting where it was, a rear-end collision had very little standing between the bumper and the tank itself, and the differential housing, a pointed component of the rear axle assembly, was positioned to puncture the tank like a spike the moment the surrounding metal crumpled inward. Ford's own pre-production crash tests had demonstrated the problem clearly. At impact speeds above 21 miles per hour, the tank ruptured, gasoline poured into the cabin, and the car became a fireball. The engineers knew several relatively inexpensive fixes existed: a rubber bladder lining the inside of the tank, a plastic shield between the tank and the differential, a reinforced bumper structure, any of which would have substantially reduced the risk. The most meaningful of these modifications would have cost somewhere around $11 per vehicle to implement during production. but $11 per vehicle, spread across millions of cars, pushed the total past $100 million, and the Pinto was already pinned against its $2,000 ceiling. So the decision was made to proceed with the design as it stood. The Pinto went on sale in the fall of 1970 and was an immediate commercial success. Ford moved over 400,000 units in the first year alone, outselling most of its direct competition and giving Iacocca exactly the market result he had pushed so hard to achieve. Within months of the launch, reports had started coming back to Dearborn about Pintos catching fire after being struck from behind, and the pattern in the incidents was difficult to explain away. These were not high-speed, catastrophic crashes. They were ordinary collisions, the kind of fender benders that drivers assumed would result in a dented bumper and an insurance claim, not a burning car. In the summer of 1972, on Interstate 5 near Santa Ana, California, a Ford Galaxy struck a Pinto from behind at around 30 miles per hour. The tank ruptured on impact, the cabin filled with gasoline, and the car caught fire within seconds. Lily Gray, the passenger, died from her injuries. The driver, a 13-year-old boy named Richard Grimshaw, survived, but with burns covering more than 90% of his body, injuries that took years of surgeries to address and left him permanently disfigured. By the mid-1970s, at least 27 people had died in similar Pinto fires following rear-end collisions, with dozens more suffering serious burn injuries, and families across the country had begun filing lawsuits against Ford. Ford's legal team contested every case. They argued that the Pinto met all applicable federal safety standards, that driver error or the behavior of the other vehicle was the real cause of the harm, and that fuel tank fires could happen in any car, that the Pinto was no more dangerous than its competitors. These were technically defensible arguments, and Ford pursued them aggressively. But as the lawsuits moved through discovery and plaintiffs' attorneys began gaining access to Ford's internal records, something far more damaging than a design flaw started coming into view. In 1977, a memo from Ford's own Environmental and Safety Engineering Division became public during the course of litigation. It was a cost-benefit analysis, the kind of document that corporations routinely produced when weighing the expense of a safety modification against the projected cost of future litigation. Ford's engineers had estimated that fixing the fuel tank across the entire affected fleet would cost $137 million, roughly $11 per vehicle, across 12.5 million cars and trucks. Then, they had calculated what it would cost to simply absorb the consequences of not fixing it. Projecting 180 burn deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, and around 2,100 burned vehicles, and using the federal government's own assigned valuations of $200,000 per fatality and $137,000 per serious injury. Ford had arrived at a total liability figure of $49.5 million. $137 million to prevent the deaths, $49 million to pay for them afterward. The memo did not need to state its conclusion out loud. The arithmetic had already done that. If this story is worth following, subscribe to the Rust Archive. There is more of it. When that document was placed in front of a jury, it changed everything about how the Grimshaw case was going to end. It was no longer a question of whether Ford had sold a car with a dangerous fuel tank. It was a question of whether Ford had identified the danger before production began, had calculated the human cost of leaving it in place, had weighed that cost against the expense of a fix, and had then made a deliberate business decision to do nothing. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They returned with $2.8 million in compensatory damages and $125 million in punitive damages, the largest punitive award in American legal history at that time. The judge later reduced the punitive figure to $3.5 million on appeal, but even at that reduced amount, the message to the auto industry was clear. A jury had looked at a corporate cost-benefit calculation and decided that the company deserved to be punished, not just for the harm done, but for the reasoning that had allowed it to happen. The verdict opened a floodgate. More lawsuits followed, media coverage intensified, and in 1978, Ford issued a voluntary recall covering 1.5 million Pinto and Bobcat models from the 1971 through 1976 production years. The fix, a longer filler pipe and a polyethylene shield between the tank and the differential, cost roughly $20 per car to install at a dealer, which was almost exactly twice what Ford had estimated it would cost to build that protection into the car during production in the first place. Not every owner complied. Some never received the recall notice, some ignored it, and some continued driving unmodified Pintos for years after the program closed, which meant the fires did not stop entirely even as Ford was doing its best to move past the controversy. By that point, the car's commercial life was effectively over anyway. Sales had been declining since 1974 as better engineered competitors from Honda, Toyota, and Datsun kept improving while the Pinto had nowhere left to go, and by 1980, Ford had decided to discontinue the model entirely. The last Pinto rolled off the Dearborn assembly line in May of that year with no ceremony attached to it and no acknowledgement that anything significant was ending. Workers finished their shifts, the line moved on to the next model, and 10 years of production simply closed. What made the Pinto scandal different from other corporate safety failures was not the scale of the harm, which was real but not unprecedented, and not even the design flaw itself, which had some parallels in other vehicles of the same era. What made it different was the memo, the fact that a calculation had been written down, that a specific dollar figure had been placed against the expected dead, and that a business decision had then been made on that basis. Other companies had made similar trade-offs. Ford was the one that put it on paper. And once a jury saw that paper, the story stopped being about a flawed car and became something else entirely. A permanent case study in what it looks like when a corporation treats its customers as a variable in a profit calculation and gets caught doing it. Ford survived it. The company went on to build some of the most successful vehicles in American automotive history, and today it remains one of the largest automakers in the world. But the name Pinto never recovered, and it never will, because some reputations are attached to a product permanently, and the image of a car burning on an ordinary highway because a company decided $11 was too much to spend tends to be one of them. The memo is still out there. The crash test footage is still out there. And the number is still out there. $49.5 million, the figure Ford put on the lives it expected to lose. Do you think that was a cold business calculation of the kind any manufacturer in that position might have made? Or do you think there was something more deliberate in it, something that earned exactly the verdict the jury handed down? Leave your answer below.